It is my sincere and great pleasure to introduce the first of our live stage keynotes, Kumi Naidoo, launch director of Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity. And many of you will know Kumi because he's had a storied career that has touched all of the SDGs, to the point that when I told my younger sister that I was introducing him today, she said, "Oh my God, I love Kumi. He killed it at Greenpeace." And it's a pretty funny thing when you think about using a word like killed in a development conference, but the reality is we mean it in the best positive sense. This is an example of a person who has just done incredible work that is so emblematic of what we are hoping to embody and continue here at the Global Festival of Ideas. So without further ado, we are thrilled to welcome to the stage Kumi Naidoo for a talk with what is possibly my favorite title ever. If Europe can have the Euro, why can't Africa have the Afro? The imperative of Pan-Africanism. Kumi Naidoo.
Thank you very much. Friends, I must confess that when I speak at meetings these days, I'm extremely nervous, because when you speak truth to power, when you say how close we are to catastrophic climate change, when you talk about our oceans that within 4 decades could be left with just algae and jellyfish in it, when we talk about our forests, which are disappearing at the rate of every 2 seconds, a forest the size of a football field disappears, you talk about the inequality crisis, you talk about the immigration crisis, and sometimes I get this response where people put up their hands and say, "Mr. Naidoo, have you heard about Martin Luther King?" And I say, yes, I did, because he inspired me as a young activist in the struggle against apartheid. And then they say, do you know what his most famous speech was called? And very tentatively I say, I have a dream, thinking it's a trick question. And the response I sometimes get back is, yes, it was I have a dream, but when you speak, it sounds as if you have a nightmare, because everything is so dire. So one of the challenges we face in the world today is how can we not sanitize the crisis that we're in? How can we speak in an honest way about the pain that millions and millions of people are suffering on a daily basis? But how can we do it in a way that you can speak above the noise and at the same time send a message of hope and that activism actually matters? So I want to draw on a wisdom from Martin Luther King, speaking in the United States in the late 60s, and I hope you can hear this.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
So it was within this context of people in Africa, particularly within civil society, feeling that we needed to draw on a wisdom of Albert Einstein, who said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get different results. And at this conference, we must ask ourselves also whether, in fact, we might be afflicted with the same problem. So why I call this talk, if Europe can have a Euro, why can't Africa have an Afro? Because the reality for us in Africa is that many of our countries do not make social, economic, cultural, linguistic, or environmental sense. They only made sense in a European colonial logic. So what we are saying through a new social movement that is emerging on the African continent, whose vision is captured in a document called the Kilimanjaro Declaration, we are saying that we refuse to be divided by the boundaries that were left by colonialism. Yes, it's a reality that we have to operate within those nation states, but we are saying that we have to and we must rise above those artificial boundaries to actually maximize the unity of people and to push for the greatest social, economic, cultural, and political integration. We want to say as Africans that, Tony Blair, for example, and some other leaders in the world were very fond of saying things like, Africa is a scar on the conscience of humanity. Some of you might remember that quotation said over and over again. I think he might have got the continent wrong when he said Africa is the scar on the conscience of humanity, because we as Africans are asserting that Africa is the richest continent underneath the ground, and that is precisely why perhaps we are one of the poorest continents above the ground. What in the jargon, in the development discourse, is sometimes called the resource curse. We are saying that we need to ensure that while there's historical injustices that have been done, including slavery, colonialism, and how African countries were kicked around as political footballs during the Cold War, there is a certain amount of responsibility and debt that still is owed. But we, as African civil society, are also saying that we cannot allow our political leaders to continue to blame colonialism for every single thing that happens. And in a context where people like President Trump want to build walls to divide Mexico and the United States, we want to say to the world that, in fact, if Africa built a wall around itself, the whole world will go out of business. So our starting point is one of assertiveness, one of pride, and one of where we are saying to our leaders that we will not continue to accept that we will have the level of poverty and inequality that we have on our continent. And when we talk about poverty and inequality, we remind ourselves that, in fact, one of the biggest diseases we face on the continent and the world is, in fact, a disease we call Affluenza. This is a pathological illness where our leaders, many on the continent but also globally, as typified by President Trump and other leaders themselves, actually European political leaders are significantly better when it comes to their level of consumption. But what we are saying is that Affluenza is a disease where enough is never enough. That, in fact, it is madness to see, for example, the Gambian president that was defeated in the election has about 30 Maseratis and Ferraris and so on parked in his village, and he hardly drove them once a year. That must be understood as a mental illness. So the agenda of Africans Rising, which will be launched on 25th of May, which is African Liberation Day, we are saying that as far as we are concerned, African freedom and liberation has not been delivered. All that we've had is a winning of elections. And as we have seen, the United States today, the holding of elections does not guarantee a democratic will. And what we are called democracies are nothing more than liberal oligarchies, where we have the form of democracy without the substance of democracy. So one of the key agendas that we are pushing forward is to put young people at the center of public life on the continent. We have far too many geriatrics in office, and let me say that I use the word geriatrics very sensitively as somebody who's heading in that direction and somebody who's been an advocate for older people's rights. But the demography of the continent and the profile of our leadership is completely out of sync. But our specific areas where we are going to campaign against is to ensure gender equality, to work for the eradication of poverty and inequality, to work for the eradication of corruption. But on corruption, we want to say that far often in the global discourse, when people talk about corruption, it's as if corruption is a peculiarly African disease or a global South disease. Let me say quite explicitly, there are three types of corruption. It's a petty corruption when a police officer stops you on the street and says, oh, if you give me $5, I'll let you go. Now that's bad, it shouldn't happen, and it's wrong. But let's be honest, that money at least circulates within the national economy. The second type of corruption is the extractive industries and the large-scale corruption. And I want to assert today that all the corruption and the money that we see flowing out of the African continent will not be possible without the collusion, participation, and complicity of powerful Western governments and Western companies. There's also a third type of corruption, and that is policy corruption. Because at one point in the world, slavery was legal. At one point in the world, denying women the right to vote was legal. Just because it was legal and it was policy in dominant parts of the world did not make it just or right. So right now, for example, the fact that exploiting fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas is legal, even though we know that is what is driving us to catastrophic climate change, doesn't make it moral, doesn't make it right. So when we look at corruption in that way, then we can understand that corruption is a much more dynamic problem with high levels of collusion amongst many countries in the world who claim to be working against corruption or claim to be promoting democracy. We also are dealing with the problem of democratic space. Throughout the world right now, we are seeing, in the name of the fight against terrorism, since 9/11, 2001, we are seeing the shrinking of democratic space. And on the African continent, not different from elsewhere in the world, we are seeing space constantly being constrained. So on 25th of May, we are mobilizing people in a different kind of launch of a new movement. We're not going to have a physical meeting like this one. We are going to ask people to actually do two things. During the day, our religious leaders, our trade union leaders, our NGO leaders, social movement leaders, between 12 and 2 are going to call for peaceful acts of mobilization where they come together, read the Kilimanjaro Declaration and commit themselves to stand up and work for justice, peace, and dignity on our continent. In the evening, between 8 and 9 p.m., we are calling on people to switch off the lights and put a candle where they have access to electricity, to show solidarity with the large numbers of people on our continent who live in absolute energy poverty, but we'll also do that in a way that sends a message to our government that if governments won't lead, the people will light the way forward to justice, peace, and dignity. I'd like to just end with a quotation from Mahatma Gandhi, which connects to what we heard from Martin Luther King. Gandhi once said, "This planet has enough to meet all of humanity's need, but not all of humanity's greed." And I contend in conclusion that of all these SDGs that we have, if we do not put at the center the SDG that relates to reducing inequality, I believe it will not be possible to meet any of the other SDGs either. Thank you very much for your attention.